Back to Christian nationalism. Could they win?
Oh, I think they're winning.
My guest today is Randall Balmer. Balmer is a leading scholar and a distinguished American historian. He has written a ton of books and articles, and they frequently spotlight the moral and ethical inconsistencies within evangelicalism, and they question Big Eva's fidelity to the actual teachings of Jesus. Balmer is a challenging figure. His penetrating critiques of evangelicalism and the religious right has drawn their sharp rebuke, of course. But despite, or perhaps because of, his analysis, Balmer is both celebrated and polarizing. Yet his work continues to spark important conversations about faith, power, and religious identity, and the complex role religion plays in American life. Balmer is a professor of religion at Dartmouth College. Randall, has Christianity in America, is it still Christianity, or has it become Christianism?
What a great question. I think there's no question that Christianity in America is in real trouble these days, and it's not merely evangelicalism, and I expect we'll probably spend most of our time talking about that, but the Catholic Church is certainly in trouble. You have the lingering effects of the pedophilia scandal. You have the Roman Catholic hierarchy that remains enamored of Donald Trump for reasons that elude me. And with mainline Protestantism, I think you have the continuation of a decades-long decline in membership, giving, and attendance that we can trace all the way back to the mid-1960s. And, I'm an Episcopal priest, and I do supply work, and a lot of the congregations that I visit, we'd be lucky to have a dozen people.
And when you say in trouble, and I happen to agree, but I'm not going to try to define that word for you. When you say Christianity in America, maybe even the West, is in trouble, what do you mean by that?
Well, I think the most obvious index would be attendance and adherence, and there's no question that this has gone down over the last several decades, including with evangelicals, who typically and historically have been the most resilient religious group in American life. In the last couple of decades, they too have seen declines, and we can talk about the reasons for that. So that is certainly the case, as kind of the simple metric of numbers. But I think the disease, the pathology, goes deeper than that, and I think that over the last 4 decades or so, evangelicals, particularly white evangelicals, have lost their way, and they have lost touch with the words of Jesus, who I regard as the Word of God, based on John chapter 1 in the New Testament. And they've also lost touch with their own history, with their own tradition. And if you look at evangelicalism in the 19th century in particular, evangelicals were very much in the forefront of social action, but that social action was directed toward those on the margins of society. And I don't see that ethic being played out today in American evangelicalism.
Yeah, so back to my question, has Christian spirituality, the religion of Christianity, has it become Christianism? Is it a Christian ideology now in America?
Yeah, I actually struggle to find much that I find Christian about it altogether. I bristle when commentators or pundits talk about the Christian right. I don't think there's anything Christian about it, to be honest. I persist in calling it the religious right, and that goes back to my childhood. I remember my mother, and I certainly was reared in an evangelical home. My father was an evangelical minister for 40 years. I remember my mother saying, if they ask you at school, are you religious? You say, no, I'm not religious. I'm a Christian. And that meant something. That meant something different than being merely religious. And religion, I think, for my mother was in some ways a dirty word. And I don't share that sentiment necessarily, but I don't find much that is Christian in what people call the Christian right. So that's where I take issue with that. So is it Christianism? I suppose it is. I'm not sure how to define that, but I guess you would point to a kind of the trappings of faith, the language, the vocabulary of faith that certainly is still prevalent. But in terms of the content, the deeper significance, I think much of that has been eroded over the last 4 decades.
So, and I'm in agreement of the Christian right's influence on Christian spirituality. So I agree with you. Nothing to disagree with, but you're also a religious historian. And I'll ask you a question that I have thoughts on, but I want your thoughts first. Would 20th century American evangelicalism still be in trouble if the religious right hadn't created more trouble for it?
Good question. It's one of those counterfactual questions that does tend to illuminate. I think it's probably the case that evangelicalism was headed for some sort of reckoning by about the 1970s, and I think they kind of faced a fork in the road. One fork of the road would have led them to an affirmation or reaffirmation of what I sometimes call progressive evangelicalism, the Jimmy Carter type of evangelical that was much more consistent with the 19th century ethic of caring for the least of these, for example. The other fork, the one they took, was in the direction of political activism that led them into the far right precincts of the Republican Party. Could they have maintained a kind of stasis beyond the middle decades of the 20th century? I suppose they could have. One of the great ironies, and I'll be personal here for a moment, if you don't mind. One of the great ironies is that I started attending an evangelical college in the fall of 1972, and I was very disturbed at the apolitical nature of everyone around me, and that was characteristic of evangelicalism at the time. And I remember, kind of passionately, and I'm sure there was overbearing and insufferable.
Yeah, weren't we all? Yeah,
at that age, especially.
Yeah,
I passionately arguing that, my classmates, my fellow students, we should be involved in politics. We should be involved in social change and things like that. And eventually they listened, and by extension, the rest of evangelicals, but they moved in the opposite direction from what we're advocating.
Sure. You're probably thinking Jimmy Carter is partly fulfilling that. Well, I mean, 1972, you're 18 years old. You're in the throes of the Jesus movement at the end of the 60s.
Right.
Campus Crusade, campus ministries are in their, they are in their peak. So when you're kind of tussling ideologically with your other Christian mates, is it more, no, the Christian faith is about proclamation, spreading the message. It's not about being involved in some altruistic human betterment that we can use politics to do it. No, it's about preaching the message. Is that what you are up against?
That's what I was encountering, yes.
Yeah, sure.
And, again, as a historian, although I'm not a theologian, I understand now what was happening. That is to say, at that time, evangelicals were very much premillennialists. That is, we expected Jesus to come back at any time. And so any other sort of social action or social engagement was considered extraneous to the real mission, which was to get everybody to repent and come to Jesus. Now, I'm going to make another confession that I'm not sure you know this about me, but so you may remember, and certainly many in my generation remember, a film, a motion picture called A Thief in the Night. Thief in the Night actually was the inspiration in turn for the Left Behind series that Jerry Jenkins and Tim LaHaye wrote and made a fortune on, right? But A Thief in the Night was produced actually in Des Moines, Iowa, where I was living at the time, by a man who was my Sunday school teacher. And it depicted, those who don't know, it depicted life on earth during the tribulation. After the rapture, this is all premillennial theology, of course, after the rapture had taken up the true believers into heaven, there was this terrible tribulation that began to set in. And this was based on my father's Sunday evening sermons at the Westchester Evangelical Free Church in Des Moines, Iowa. And my father played the good preacher in that film, which Time magazine called a church basement classic. And I mention that only to say that premillennialism was entrenched among evangelicals into the 1970s and even beyond that.
Sure.
But that begins to change. So when we're talking about would evangelicalism had remained the same had it not been for the emergence of the religious right? Probably not. I think there probably was a change coming, and not to become too sociological about this, but what I've noticed over the course of my lifetime among evangelicals is that the mantra when I was growing up, it was always, Lord, come quickly.
Yeah.
That is, we expected Jesus to come, and we were looking for Jesus to come at any time. Now, as I look around, the mantra among evangelicals is, Lord, take your time.
Huh.
We're doing okay.
Yeah, right.
Kids are going to good schools. We just bought a new house in the suburbs. We're winning the culture wars. They won't admit that, but they are at the moment. We're winning the culture wars. And, take your time. And that's a sea change. That's a radical redirection on the part of evangelicals. And it was redirected in part because of their political success. I don't think there's any question about that. I sometimes talk about the worldliness of American evangelicalism. When I was growing up within this subculture in the middle decades of the 1900s, the 20th century. We're talking now about the 1950s and 60s. The most damning thing you could say about a fellow believer was that she or he was worldly. And that had all sorts of connotations. It could mean, sexual license, drugs, alcohol, and in my day, dancing, of course, was taboo, movies and that sort of thing. But it also included a very strong suspicion of affluence. I heard a lot of sermons growing up about camels and the eyes of needles. I haven't heard a sermon about that in decades.
No.
And that, I think, is what I sometimes call the worldliness of American evangelicals. And it begins about 1980 for reasons we can discuss later. But evangelicals begin to relax a lot of their defenses as they are beginning to accumulate political influence. And one of the things that relaxes significantly is this denunciation of affluence. I don't think it's any accident whatsoever that the so-called prosperity gospel flourishes in the 1980s. This is the era of Reaganomics, trickle-down economics. And I don't think it's any accident whatsoever that people like Jim Baker and Kenneth Copeland begin to amass these huge audiences in the 1980s. And what they're preaching is a kind of spiritualized Reaganomics in the 1980s. So that I take as an index of the worldliness that began to affect American evangelicals in the 1980s.
Yeah, and, I certainly agree that the venture into politics, especially from Reagan to Trump, is affecting it. At the same time, Randall, I've been a minister for 40 years now, 30 of those years entrenched in evangelicalism. Now, I'm going to say something, and I say it in jest and kitschy, but I was a convert. So I grew up Italian Catholic, and then converted in 1980. I got born again, got saved in those days. Yep. And it was a result of my parents' divorce. But I then went down the road of super cool, hip evangelicalism. I went the way of campus ministry, of campus ministry at USC. And then when I was done with campus ministry, I ended up on the staff of Willow Creek. So I was in this big, white, suburban, affluent, certainly not charismatic or Pentecostal, no. Certainly not high church like Presbyterians. Super hip, cool church, which we might have voted for Reagan, but we had a proclamation idea, like, let's not get mixed up in politics. The job is to sell, is to share the message. Here's my point in that long soliloquy. I think the faith was also in trouble, just based on, by the end of the 20th century, the intellectual ideas just are not fitting with a supernatural, classical, theistic God. And I'll go into that in a moment or a little later. But, because it seems like this progressive movement that we're seeing, it's not like when you and I were staunch evangelicals, we kept hearing about the liberal church, the liberal Protestant church. That's not where it's coming from. It's coming from the sons and daughters and converts of evangelicalism that it just no longer makes sense. So I've moved out of evangelicalism, but as I was saying before we turned the cameras on, for some weird reason, I've stayed with it because of this existential connection, deep personal connection I have to my faith and to a God and a divine, and and Jesus for me is still important to me. So I know you're a historian and not a futurist, but you're certainly a scholar, and you're a smart person. Where does Christianity end up at the end of the 21st century versus, I don't think the 20th century had a good ending.
No.
So where's it end up?
I think that depends entirely on, frankly, a course correction. My most recent book is called Saving Faith: How American Christianity Can Reclaim Its Prophetic voice. And what I argue there, and I guess I would offer in response to your question, is that if we continue on the trajectory we're on, I think it will become irrelevant. And it already is to a growing number of people. I mean, if you look at the Gallup data or any other polling data over the last couple of decades, the number of so-called nones is rising steadily, and those who are affiliated in some way with the faith, at least formally affiliated with the faith, is going down. So these two trajectories are crossing. So yes, I think unless there's a course correction, I don't see a lot of hope. Now, what would that course correction look like?
Yeah, I was going to say, Randall, what kind of Christianity are we trying to save? What kind of Christianity should we save?
Exactly, and what I try to argue in that book, it's a very slim volume, is that we have to somehow find a way to recover our prophetic voice as believers, and I firmly put myself in that camp. And that means reaffiliating with the words of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, so the actions of Jesus that we find in the Gospels. I think it also means reaffiliating, for evangelicals at least, reaffiliating with the best of our past, which is not that long ago. If you look back into the 19th and early 20th centuries, you see people who were very much concerned about acts of charity, particularly toward those Jesus would call the least of these. And I think if we can recover that somehow, I think there is a future. Otherwise, I think these churches are going to become museums, as they have in other parts of the world, or simply crumbled into disrepair. And what Gary Wills calls in the Catholic context, bare ruined choirs. I think that's going to happen. So, and I think there's some urgency to this. I think.
I agree. By the way,
I'm going to jump track here for a second here. I mean, in many ways, what I've tried to do with my career, my writing over the last couple of decades, is to call my fellow evangelicals back to their better selves and say, look, this is what you once were. This is what this tradition once was, and you've wandered off the ranch rather dramatically, and you got to find your way back. And you can see for yourself how stunningly successful I've been in my arguments in trying to advocate for a course correction. But the other thing about a prophetic voice, I think, and this is, again, based on my observations about American religious history, I think the most effective religious voices or prophetic voices have come from the margins and not in the councils of power. That is to say, I think that religion itself functions best from the margins and not in the councils of power. And what we've seen among white evangelicals since 1980, well, really late 1979, is evangelicals, or at least their leaders, kind of following this scent of power and influence and hanging out with the cool guys. In that case, in the 1980s, it was Ronald Reagan and his people, and having unlimited access to the Oval Office and that sort of thing. And that is a hankering after political influence. And do you think that Jerry Falwell once raised a prophetic voice in the Oval Office in conversations with Ronald Reagan or George H.W. Bush or anybody else, George W. Bush or anybody else for that matter? I doubt it. I highly doubt it. And
or even
what's going on,
or even, and I'll commit sacrilege right here, or even Billy Graham.
Billy Graham too.
Yeah.
I have a great deal of admiration for Billy Graham, but and we're all fallible. There's no question about that, and he would be the first to acknowledge that in himself. But
Sure.
yes, Graham had the opportunity many, many times to speak to power, and he had the ear of powerful people. But as far as we know, he did not exercise the prophetic voice. He did not articulate things that might have changed the course of history. So I think voices coming from the margins, I think, are always much more effective. And the other example of this is mainline Protestantism. I said earlier that mainline Protestants, by all these indices, begin to decline in the mid-1960s. Well, what was the history of it up to that? At that point, in the post-war era, particularly until the mid-1960s, mainline Protestants were very much part of the power elite in this country. And in so doing, they eventually lost their prophetic voice. And when they did finally recover it in opposition to the war in Vietnam, by that time they were not able to bring their congregants along with them. Now that's highly simplistic explanation. There's much more to it, but I think that the basic point is this is an example of a religious group, religious leaders, not speaking from the margins. That is trying to curry influence among the political elite, and losing their prophetic voice. So if Christianity in America is to reclaim any sort of worthy witness in the 21st century, I think American Christians, and particularly their leaders, have to somehow reclaim their prophetic voice. If not, then it becomes, Christianity becomes another interest group. It becomes a constituency. We're seeing this with the Trump campaign. Donald Trump cares about theology or evangelicalism, or don't even try to make that point in that argument. Right. He sees this as a constituency that he can exploit for his own political benefit. No, that's what politicians do. I'm not criticizing that in itself, but it tells me that this group has become stands for nothing other than a demographic, desirable demographic.
I think you're right, because politicians will be politicians no matter what. Yeah. But I don't think that's how both George Bushes being evangelicals did not have that attitude towards evangelicals. Listen, Barack Obama threw himself in that category till they vilified him for the kind of church he went to.
Right.
But he didn't seem to vilify that. To your point, Randall, on the urgency, and I totally agree. One of the phrases I'll say is, can we make Christianity beautiful? Can we bring out the beauty again in Christianity? Now, like Trump's silly phrase, you could say, what Christianity do you want to make beautiful again? Colonial Christianity? Which... Mm-hmm. So it can have its criticism, but I certainly, this is probably what I mean. I still hold that the backbone of Christian spirituality is love. I still hold that, right? I think the backbone of Christianity...
You've read the New Testament.
That's right. So Christianity is, and now I'm speaking to an American religion historian. Christianity has been in America since the Puritans came. It's been here 400 years.
Right.
Randall, if the cornerstone of Christian spirituality, now we're talking 2,000-year-old Christian spirituality, if the cornerstone is love, what happened to the concept of love in American religious Christianity? What happened to it?
Wow. That's, that might be beyond my pay grade.
Well, we lost our way, right? We lost
our way. Yeah, and I think in recent history, and I'm talking now about the past century or so, that approach has come to be associated with mainline Protestantism, and it's been kind of vilified, particularly by evangelicals, as being kind of too soft and squishy. And
love ended up being wimpy, didn't it?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, right.
Well, and I think maybe trying to think about it, these are great questions. You're forcing me to think beyond my usual nostrums here. It probably became squishy when it was divorced from action. James says, faith without works is dead, which John Kerry quoted several times in his presidential campaign in 2004. And it became, as you say, squishy because it was cheap. It was anybody. Oh yeah, I love everybody. I accept everybody without criticism. And that may be a fair indictment of mainline Protestantism, that anything goes sort of thing. And the other argument I've made about religions in America is that in many ways the most popular or successful, and we'd have to talk about what we mean by successful, but in many ways the most successful religious movements in American history have been exclusive rather than inclusive. And if your ethic is, this squishy love sort of thing, everybody come on in, maybe that's not quite so attractive as, say, the Mormons or the Roman Catholic Church, who have pretty clear boundaries about who's in and who's out.
But could that be speaking to? I mean, neither one of us are psychologists, but I'm sure we've read a number of papers, academic papers on the psychology of religion. A religion that thrives through exclusivity versus the mealy, mushy inclusivity, doesn't that speak more to the psychology of religion versus the theology of religion?
Sure, I think so. That's right. And I think the other thing that happens, too, is my friend David Hollinger, recently retired from University of California, Berkeley, has argued that one of the casualties of mainline Protestantism is that it became theologically unmoored. I may be putting words in his mouth, so I'll try to claim this as my own thoughts and not try to indict him. He may not agree with this, but it became theologically unmoored. In part, I would argue, because of the ecumenical movement, where the idea was to elide all of these theological differences. Oh, we all can agree on everything and that sort of thing. And with that, you have this sort of, as you say, this squishy love. And what happened, and this I will attribute to David, what happened at that point is that younger folks reared within that tradition who had imbibed those values simply decided that they could work more effectively in secular social agencies or nonprofit entities rather than directing their efforts through the church or denominations, whatever the institutional form might be. And I think that's probably that argument I find somewhat persuasive.
I'll attempt something contrarian here, and I think you already started to go down that when you were talking about Christianity. Maybe I'll chance a word. Authentic, real Christianity tends to thrive in the backwaters. So with all of this, again, my words, not yours, with all of this popular Christianism, with all of this American Jesus-ism, couldn't the irony of it is that it recreates a backwater faith again? And I'll illustrate that before you answer. I am, of course, for all the said reasons you have stated, of course I didn't support Trump, of course. But I launched a progressive church in Nashville right around the time he became the president. And the fact that 70 to 80% evangelicals voted for him only helped my little progressive church.
Yeah, sure.
If that makes sense.
Sure.
I mean, it was a bunch of people like me who go, wait a second, I've had an actual connection with this God. I can't and will not give that up. This box of American Jesus, American evangelicalism, I'll gladly pitch that, especially now that it hitches its train to this thing. So as Christianity begins its third millennium, could this be causing a greater shift that authentic Christian spirituality needs?
Oh, well, yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely, and you just gave a perfect example of that sort of thing. Yes, I mean, I think if there's any hope for a reclamation, for a revitalization of the faith, it's going to have to come from rump movements like this one that you're talking about. Absolutely, and it is a reaction to what's going on. I mean, I think, and I think the numbers out there are probably greater than either of us even imagine. I have to believe.
You mean the backwater contrarian? Yeah, I do. Yeah, I think they are.
I have to believe that they're. I mean, maybe I'm a hopeless optimist, and I do tend to be, but I have to believe that there are legions of people out there who just are shaking their heads as, what?
Yeah.
The hell is going on here?
Yeah.
And
yes.
And I refuse to join this stampede, which is just. I mean, it's so contrary to everything that.
Well, I love your hopeless optimism, and if I can just still being a minister, and you are too, but I mean, still being a minister that vocally left that world and then launched a progressive Christian church, which, let's be honest, even that label is not going to last. That, whatever we call this shift, this evolving faith, this moving away from American Jesus-ism, Randall, it's happening. I gathered with 100 clergy in Raleigh, North Carolina, at a wonderful church there, and it is beginning to grow. This podcast is dedicated to this whole kind of thing, and it's small, but you know what? I when I was in that Willow Creek Campus Crusade kind of Christianity, I kind of say, I played for the Yankees. A single A ball there's something still exciting about single A baseball because you're seeing real baseball.
You are.
And so there is this backwater movement. And back to some of the theology and doctrine, because I think your own arc, Randall, you've theologically, even though you're Episcopal priest and sounds like practicing, doing supply.
Yes.
You've moved away from your own evangelical doctrines, and it's not just because of Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and Cal Thomas, right? It's Cal Thomas. Remember Cal Thomas?
I do.
it's not just because of that. If I'm gonna guess about you, maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah. No, it's not just because of that. By the way, I have a quick Cal Thomas story.
Please.
Cal Thomas, of course, for those who don't know or don't remember, is he still doing his column? Is he still doing it?
Is he still alive? Is he still alive?
Well, he became a kind of a go-to syndicated columnist for conservative, for the religious right, and actually ended up working for Jerry Falwell. But when I was doing archival research for my biography of Jimmy Carter down at the Carter Presidential Library in Atlanta, I came across a letter from Cal Thomas to Jimmy Carter, begging Jimmy Carter for a job in the Carter administration.
Sure. Well, conviction or power?
Yeah, right. Exactly. And actually, I wrote to Thomas to ask him about it, and he refused to comment. Anyway, I lost track of your.
No.
Apologize.
Let me. Well, you and I are kind of. We're talking about the future, but let me just say this: it's 2024, and Randall, should we be worried about Christian nationalism?
Absolutely. Christian nationalism is one of the most I mean, it's I mean, again, I hate to use the word Christian because there's nothing Christian about it. It's a dangerous idea. It's a very dangerous idea, and I think it can be refuted on all sorts of grounds, but let me try three. First of all, biblical and theological. Jesus, I mean, this is a pretty important person in our faith tradition. Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." End of conversation, right? That should deal the death blow to this Christian nationalism nonsense. Historically, it's just, I mean, it's, this stuff that the founders were evangelical Christians. I mean, give me a break. I mean, that's ludicrous. I like to say that with the very, very possible exception of Benjamin Rush, who was a physician, and John Witherspoon, who was the president of the College of New Jersey, now Princeton, with the very possible exception of those two, none of the founders would be welcome as members in any of the congregations now arguing for Christian nationalism. I mean, Thomas Jefferson, would Thomas Jefferson be a member of Thomas Road Baptist Church, or, you name whatever? I mean,
yeah. By the way, that's no small statement you made, that none of the founding fathers would be accept. Yeah.
No, I mean, not even, no, it wouldn't even be close.
That's right.
No.
I mean, even Barry Goldwater and I want to believe Ronald Reagan wouldn't even like what's going on.
No, that's right. Absolutely. No.
Or William Buckley, they would, right?
True. That's true. That's true. Historically, again,
have we ever come this close? Like when you look at, maybe aside from the theonomy of the Massachusetts Bay colony, and then once we colonized, the 13 colonies become states. When you think of the first, second, third, fourth Great Awakenings, have we ever gotten this close to this kind of religious theonomy?
Not quite this close, but there have been attempts, and it tends to occur in times of perceived crisis. Now, any era can be defined as a crisis, of course, but during the War of 1812, for example, Timothy Dwight argued that America's troubles were due to the fact that we hadn't acknowledged Jesus or hadn't acknowledged God in the charter documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. During the Civil War, there was an organization called the National Reform Association, NRA, actually, National Reform Association, which is still around, that drafted a constitutional amendment that would declare the United States to be a Christian nation. They took it all the way to Abraham Lincoln, who wisely temporized and said, well, let me think about it, get back to you, and never did. Again, wisely. After the school prayer decisions in the 1960s, there was another surge of interest in amending the Constitution to declare that the United States is a Christian nation. So we've had these close calls before. What's different now is that we have a Supreme Court that does not respect the First Amendment. Given the recent decisions, I told somebody that I wish we had a Supreme Court that gave half as much deference to the First Amendment as it does to the Second Amendment. It's that really worries me. The Supreme Court worries me a lot because they just have no respect for the First Amendment. Going back historically, and then I'll come back to the third point. The Treaty of Tripoli was negotiated under George Washington's administration, sent to the Senate for ratification by John Adams, and ratified unanimously by the United States Senate on June 7th, 1797. Article 11 of the Treaty of Tripoli reads, and I don't have it in front of me, but this is a very close paraphrase. The United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. The United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion.
Right. And if I remember, and you can give more context, the Treaty of Tripoli, in our foreign, obviously in our foreign policy then, we're dealing with what is a Muslim state,
yes.
Right?
Yes.
And the Muslim state is worried that this new nation, America,
right,
might potentially Christianize. Was it about shipping lanes or
it was the
trade?
The Barbary Coast pirates were disrupting the shipping.
That's right. So they're worried that since we're a theonomy and going to Christianize this Muslim state. Is that the context?
Exactly. Right. Yeah.
So then the treaty they put that in writing.
Yeah. The United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. And one goes on to say that we have no enmity toward Muslims, essentially, is what it says. So, this Christian nationalism, it's baseless. And the guy who's doing all this damage is this David Barton, who claims to be a historian. He's not.
Yeah, how are you doing with him as a historian?
I think the fact that Thomas Nelson Publishers in your home city of Nashville withdrew his Jefferson Lies from publication tells you something about David Barton as a historian. So Christian nationalism can be refuted theologically or biblically, historically, but third, tactically. The First Amendment is the best friend that religion has ever had. I think the First Amendment is America's best idea.
Yeah, I've heard you say that. Yeah,
and
yes,
it is because it set up a free marketplace for religion and mandated that the government stayed out of the religion business. And this has created a vibrant marketplace for religion, which means that we are the most religious country on the planet by most indices. It's precisely because of the First Amendment, and trying to collapse this distinction between church and state is the wrong. It's tactically the wrong. And the people who are arguing for this are arguing against their own best interests.
Yes.
And let me go back historically and try to put more context on this. The person responsible for this metaphor of separation between church and state is Roger Williams, who's the founder of the Baptist tradition in America. And Roger Williams wrote that he wanted to separate the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world by means of a wall of separation. Now, what we miss in that metaphor, because we are modern, post-Henry David Thoreau people, is that Roger Williams and his contemporaries did not share our romance about wilderness. I mean, they were not members of the Sierra Club, which is to say, when he talks about protecting the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world, his concern is the integrity of the faith, lest it be compromised by too close an association of the state. Now, I'll give you a further example of this, if you don't mind my going on here.
No, please.
I'm sure you remember, and other people remember, in 2001, Roy Moore, at that time the Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court, plopped a granite monument in the lobby of the Judicial Building in Montgomery, emblazoned with the Ten Commandments.
Yeah.
At the same time, he refused any other religious representation in that place. Hindu, even the Alabama Atheist Association, both members probably, had a petition to allow their views to be in that space. He said, no, nothing but the Ten Commandments, which is a precursor now of what's happening in Louisiana.
Oh, my gosh. Yes.
Which is just, it's just nonsense. And I was one of the expert witnesses in that case. And when Judge Thompson ruled correctly that the monument in that public space represented a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment and ordered the monument removed, one of the protesters screamed, "Get your hands off my God." I think you and I agree one of those commandments says something about a graven image.
Yeah, right.
And that was precisely Roger Williams' point. Protect the garden of the world the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world by means of a wall of separation.
That's right.
We're in a bad state right now, as a country, as a society, in part because in 1979 we lost our most reliable watchman on that wall of separation, and that was the Southern Baptist Convention, that up until 1979 were real Baptists, meaning that they believed in liberty of conscience and the separation of church and state. And after the conservative takeover in 79, they abandoned that, and now they're arguing for a collapse of those two entities, and we are in trouble.
Yeah, and I know I agree. I especially as a religious historian, that the conservative takeover by Paige Patterson, Al Mohler of the SBC and others, right? And if I could tie it to a theology, which was both those guys are Calvinists.
Yeah. Which is unlikely, but yes.
Yeah, right. Nobody could have ever assumed the SBC would go Calvinistic. But, we'll come back to history, but dabbling in some theology and the historic ideas of theology. And this is my contrarian idea question, do some of even Christian theology in its first two millenniums need to be saved, or does some Christian theology that served its time, I'm not taking a shot at it, needs to evolve into the third millennium? Because, Randall, what happens if you believe that the Bible is inerrant? What happens if you believe that the authority of God is my interpretation of the Bible? Don't you get Baptist takeovers? Don't you get sewing the Bible in the flag? Don't you get Christian theonomies? Don't you get Ten Commandments in all Louisiana classrooms? And with much boldness, the Attorney General of Louisiana saying, "Come sue me. Come on. Come sue me." So, and that's what I'm seeing, that some of these staid Christian theologies, regardless of somebody maybe not abusing them, the sons and daughters of those faiths just intellectually cannot wrap their mind around that anymore because they have Muslim friends, they have gay friends, they have Jewish friends, and they go, well, I don't want to not be Christian anymore, but my Christian God can't send all of my non-Christian people I love to Christian hell.
And I would argue the reason for that is the theology of the incarnation. I think that the beauty of what you just said is it points to the centrality, the importance of the incarnation. It's much harder for me to condemn Muslims or gays or trans people or whatever it is if I'm sitting across the dinner table from a real person. Now, in the abstract, I can go a little bit berserk. This trans stuff, I have to say, I'm working on it. It's a bit of a challenge for me. But I mean, I know where my faith needs to lead me on that issue.
Meaning, are you saying you at times have a difficult? Are you? I'm just asking questions. Are you just a man of your generation?
Yeah,
and you're partly.
It's just I find it difficult to understand, frankly. It's just it's.
But I think I heard the latter part. Your faith ultimately wants to lead you to a place of love,
and it will. It already has. But it's just something that kind of viscerally, as a 70-year-old man or almost 70, it's just it's a bit of a jolt for me. But and it's because and it. If there's somebody there in front of me, it's much more difficult to issue sort of blanket condemnation. I think, by the way, that one of the things in my lifetime that shocked me, number one, was the election of an African-American as president. But the second thing was how quickly Americans came around to the notion of same-sex marriage. Now, there's a backlash. I don't want to dismiss that, but how and generally acceptance of gay folks, and I think the reason for that is that, as you were just saying, more and more people had children of friends who came out of the closet, and again, it's much more difficult to issue blanket condemnations when you're dealing with a real person in front of you. And I think that's the power of the incarnation.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, holding on to my Christian spirituality, Jesus was a people person. And it seems like when you read the Gospels and the narratives, Jesus' entire ministry is engaged with people. And yes, and I'll say the same, 30% of the church I am the minister at is probably LGBTQ. The rest, obviously, are my straight allies and extremely protective of that. And then we have a few trans people. But to your point, you make a right statement. When a person is in front of you, and you're connecting with someone's heart and life, and you are seeing the value of a person versus ideas we hold. I think our theology should teach that love ultimately should crush any kind of exclusion of.
I think that's right.
Of any way.
And I think that's the message of Jesus. I mean, love trumps law. And always. I mean, that's, if I had to boil down the message of the New Testament, of the Gospels, I mean, that's what it is.
And that's why I'm still in. And because it is still a radical challenge to me.
It is. Yeah.
I've come to the point where my hermeneutic on Jesus's phrase, his teaching of, follow me. The way to me is narrow, and the way to the world is wide.
Yeah.
If you remember, Jesus is being challenged by Pharisees that don't really like his love ethic, which is That's why they don't like him.
Absolutely.
Because he is lowering the fence of inclusion. He's saying everybody. And he's telling stories about great feasts and highways and byways. Invite everybody, and they don't like it. And how I interpret that, Randall, is the narrow way is love, because the love is the hard way.
It is.
That is the hard way.
That's right.
The wide way is popular religion. The wide way is doctrine. Of course, our evangelical friends, that all got moralized. The wide way is homosexuality. The wide way are these unconservative ideas.
Right.
And we've defined that over the years, from card playing all the way to abortion.
Right.
And I think, no. The narrow way, the wide way is the way of the Pharisee, because that's easy to pick, because that soothes our psychology.
That's right.
The narrow way is love, and that will always be the most radical and hardest thing to pick, because it will always confront us the most. No, am I crazy here?
No, you're absolutely right. No, and think about the Pharisees responding or reacting to Jesus healing on the Sabbath. I mean, what's he saying there? What is Jesus saying there? He says, you have your laws, fine. But there's something that's going to supersede that, and that is love, compassion, all the things that Jesus taught about.
Yeah,
I want to circle back to your observation about theology, and we kind of talked offhandedly about the surge of Calvinism within the Southern Baptist Convention, which I mean, if people don't know, is historically anomalous, to say the least. And why is that? And the same thing happened in my denomination, the denomination in which I was reared. My father was a minister in the Evangelical Free Church, and what happened there is that when they started a seminary in Deerfield, Illinois, which is where I attended.
Me too. That's where I went.
Did you really?
Yeah, I went to Trinity, Ted's, yeah.
All right, well, then you would know this. The Free Church itself, historically, comes out of the Wesleyan holiness tradition.
Mm-hmm.
But by the time you got there, it was rock rib Calvinist, right?
For
Which
sure.
is just theologically the opposite pole, as you know very well.
No, Wayne Grudem was my systematic theology teacher.
Yeah, you have some stories. Yeah, well,
yeah.
Well, I wrote my thesis there, my MA thesis under John Woodbridge. Biblical inerrancy.
Yeah.
So but what is just fascinating to me is that the seminary under Kenneth Conser goes to the Calvinists, goes to the Reformed tradition, which again is just utterly the opposite pole within Christian theology of the Wesleyan holiness tradition. And I've kind of puzzled over this for decades, but I think what happened is that they, at least Conser, decided that Calvinism was more intellectually respectable. And so if you're going to build a seminary, you want to be Calvinist. You want to be in the Reformed tradition. And so what that seminary has done over the decades is, as these graduates go out and assume pastorates within the denomination, they've transformed the entire denomination from the Wesleyan and holiness tradition to Calvinism. I mean, my father, at the end of his career, was a district superintendent out in Central California. And he had in his district a woman who was an ordained Evangelical Free Church pastor, right? And we both know that, the Free Church today is just death on women's ordination. It's because of this Calvinist stuff. But I think it's because Calvinism was regarded as more intellectually respectable.
Mm.
And as I'm sure you know, the beauty of Calvinism, and I really have to admire it, although I do so now from afar, the beauty of Calvinism is that once you accept Calvinistic presuppositions, total depravity, a limited atonement and all that stuff. Once you accept those presuppositions, you enter into an intellectual vortex where you can answer anything. You can account for anything. It's a beautiful system. I think it's flawed, but it's a beautiful system. That's the beauty of Calvinism. And so I think that's the reason that somebody like Al Mohler is attracted to Calvinism, even though it's just utterly contrary to his roots as a Southern Baptist. Al Mohler has other contradictions that we can go into later. But
well, I'll chance something a little more human and vulnerable here in what you're saying. Randall, I've had to do a fair amount of therapy, to work my way out of evangelicalism. And to your point, and I agree with you, Calvinism is clean. There's no doubt. It has a psychological balm. And this is back to my psychology of religion versus a doctrine. I think we find as humans, we find coping mechanisms that can psychologically clean things up. I think it's part of the tussle of life, of working out our salvation, so to speak, is learning that you're not in control of everything. And so Calvinism, even evangelicalism, it's a perfect narrative. You got a guy in a white hat, you got a guy in a black hat, and you got a damsel tied to the railroad tracks. And the ultimate narrative of history or of the future is to save both the good guy and the bad guy want the damsel, and the man in the white hat ultimately wins. It's a wonderful narrative, but I think, and I'm probably sidetracking here, I think what part of this shift, and I'm trying this on academics, historians, I'm just a minister in Nashville, Tennessee, but I think the shift is deeper than the social and political issues. It includes that. I am not being dismissive of that at all. It's even deeper than some of even profound theology. I think what is shifting is the idea of classical theism. I think the idea will be, can I still honor, I'll even ask this question of you. Randall, can someone not only embrace, but live out their Christian spirituality and not necessarily hold to the concept of God is personhood in the sky, a supernatural personhood
right.
that walks with me and talks with me. And I think that is what is shifting. The concept of that kind of God, at least in the West, is not necessarily fitting. I don't know. Am I nuts? Am I crazy?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
It's true. I might be nuts. That part.
No.
True, but...
no. Yeah. Yeah. No, there are a lot of folks who have gone in that direction, certainly, and I'm not sure I'm quite ready to follow up there. But I understand that. Yeah, I understand that.
Do you remember your apophatic theology and your cataphatic theology? That cataphatic theology is the theology we can know, which that's God is like my father. God is my brother. He walks with me and talks with me.
Right.
So as a human being, I need a cataphatic theology.
Sure.
I need a theology that helps take this immense concept of God
right.
to my limitations. Right. I definitely have to have a cataphatic God.
Right.
But God is also apophatic. God is what we can't describe God as.
Right.
God also includes that. And I think what happened with evangelicalism versus Catholicism is once Luther and Calvin deconstructed from their Catholicism, evangelicalism lost apophatic faith and only embraced cataphatic faith.
That's certainly possible. Yeah, that's certainly possible. Yeah, and you see it certainly reflected in evangelical hymnody and that sort of thing too. That's a pretty clear illustration of what you're talking about,
right?
But you know, it gives people a way to relate. I think, and in that sense, it's probably not that. I don't think it's nefarious necessarily. It's just a way personifying the deity and to make the deity relate. I was going to say him, but I was always reluctant to ascribe gender pronouns to the deity. But it makes the deity.
How apophatic of you!
Yeah,
yes,
right. Yeah, right. I know better. Yeah, I suppose that that's a way to, and I think the danger in this kind of conversation, and I mean, not that there's anything nefarious about this conversation, but I think for a lot of people, if you strip that away, that is the cataphatic, did you call it? Cataphatic away, and you have to give them something else. It seems to me. Otherwise, they're just kind of, that. I remember my wife, who's much more theologically astute than I am, her criticism of Bishop Spong, John Shelby Spong, is that not that he was wrong necessarily in the things that he was advancing theologically, but it had the effect of stripping away these kind of reliable, venerable tropes and theologies, and didn't have anything to replace it. And for the average parishioner, the average congregant, they're left with nothing. And I think there's a real danger in that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think, in fact, what I'd say, in healthy theology, you need both. But I think those two sides have to evolve as culture evolves. I mean, you're a historian, so it used to be, some Puritan walks around with a neurodivergent disease, and that person is now a devil that we need to sink at the bottom of the well.
Right.
My point is, we progress.
Right.
Of these things. Back to Christian nationalism. Could they win?
Oh, I think they're winning. And the decisive entity, I think, here is the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has no respect whatsoever for the First Amendment. And, if, for example, the Alabama Ten Commandments case, which we talked about earlier, came up before the Supreme Court today, I think it's very likely that they would say, "Hey, go for it. We don't worry about the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment any longer." To
the Supreme Court, Randall, do we like when we say we have a Supreme Court that is some of this revealing their religious views? Certainly, it seems like Thomas is an evangelical. Certainly seems like Alito, or certain Alito's wife, is
Catholic. I mean,
conservative Catholic.
Oh yeah.
Like Amy, like our Coney Barrett, she is
right.
Do we know where Gorsuch and religiously is?
I think Gorsuch actually is Episcopalian. No, I'm
How about John Roberts? Do we know where he is?
I think I'd have to look, but the majority on the Supreme Court is Catholic.
Yeah.
Now, that may include Sotomayor. I'm not sure. I'd have to look at the tally again. But I think, what happened was during the presidencies where these appointments were made, each of these presidents really owed their election to the religious right. Certainly Reagan did, and he appointed several. George W. Bush, and now Trump. They owed their election to the religious right. Well, how do you pay them back? Of course, the big plum is a Supreme Court appointment. So the logical thing would be to say, well, I'm going to appoint an evangelical jurist. Name one. and I mean, they're coming up through the ranks now, and I'm not sure I'd call them evangelical, at least in my definition of the term, but they claim to be. And I think during those presidencies, Reagan, George W. Bush, and Trump, what they did essentially was to farm out or appoint proxies, which were conservative Catholics, because there were really no qualified jurists to appoint to the Supreme Court. So that's why you have an overwhelmingly conservative Catholic presence on the Supreme Court. I believe that Thomas himself is Catholic as well, but don't hold me to that.
Yeah, and aside from theology, we know socially a conservative Protestant and a conservative Catholic many times share the same social worldview. In your book, you give a wonderful quote from by Rabbi Abraham Heschel.
Yeah.
And I want to...
Whose daughter is my colleague here at Dartmouth, by the way.
Oh, wow. Wow. I was thinking I had it here, but I guess, when a number of years ago, Russell Moore was... he hadn't left the SBC yet, right. But he was asked about, I think it was the first time the Pew polls and the Gallup polls had shown that even evangelicals were losing numbers. Remember when you and I were young evangelicals, that was one of our bragging and touting points. We're growing, the evangelicals are growing and the mainline liberals are losing. It was one of our...
Right.
And finally, 30, 40 years later, it catches up. But he was giving a commentary, and his commentary was, this is how I'll surmise it. He said it more artfully than I'm going to attempt now, but it was double down on evangelicalism. Here's why. If we're losing these numbers, we better double down on our doctrine. We better double down on the authority of the Bible. We better double down on evangelism, discipleship, all of these kinds of things. And I just sat there and go, oh my gosh, he's not listening. And to your Abraham Heschel comment, a quote, and I don't have it here. Okay. I'll put this in the form of a question with your book. It's not secularism that did this to us, did it, Randall? Right. We did this to ourselves,
Absolutely.
Didn't we?
Yeah, that's a great quote. And yes, secularism did not do it to us. We've done it to ourselves, and we've lost sight of Jesus, I would argue. We've lost sight of the Word of God, or we've reduced the Word of God to the Bible. Would be another way of saying that. We've both seen these televangelists say, this is the Word of God, shaking, riffling through the pages. Well, again, if you take John 1 seriously, Jesus is the Word of God. And I'm trying to figure out how to take that seriously. But I think it means trying to pattern my life after Jesus, rather than searching for proof texts to excoriate gays or immigrants or whoever it might be. I think I don't think Jesus would do that. In fact, he was very clear that he didn't do that.
Right. So, Randall, personal to you, obviously you talk about your dad was an E-free minister.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, so you obviously grew up in that. You, at one point, are at an evangelical... was your undergrad at an evangelical?
Trinity College.
So you went to Trinity, and then you went to TEDS.
Yep. TEDS is Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, by the way.
Right, part of it. Yeah, and then, but at some point, your own arc personally changes. When did that happen? How did it happen? Why did it happen?
It happened probably in graduate school at Princeton. As I mentioned, I'd written my MA thesis on the whole inerrancy thing. Historically, I wasn't not a theological treatment, but a historical one. And I remember when I got into Princeton University, my advisor, John Woodbridge at Trinity, said, he got really quiet. And he said, they're going to come after you on inerrancy when you get to Princeton. Okay. I was there 5 years. Not one person asked my views on inerrancy during those 5 years. And my point is to say, it wasn't that I drifted away from evangelicalism. I still consider myself an evangelical, although, I have to spend a lot of time defining what that means or what I think it should mean. But during my graduate years, I simply wasn't interested in the same questions that were consuming the people at Trinity Divinity School. And so I kind of, in that sense, drifted away. Again, not out of rebellion, but out of lack of interest, I think, in what had consumed it. And you've been to that, you were a student there, and so you knew how vicious, some of these debates and personalities could be. And I was turned off by that, quite frankly. And then one of my classmates at Trinity College had become an Episcopalian and eventually became an Episcopal priest, and I was kind of intrigued with that because that was kind of, that was dangerous territory, that sort of thing. And one Sunday when I was a grad student at Princeton, I walked about 2 blocks down to Trinity Church in Princeton, Episcopal Church, and I walked in the door and I felt like I came home. And it was a lot of things. I loved the liturgy. I loved the sense of historical connectedness. I loved the space. The space said that something important happens here. I wasn't exactly sure at that time what that meant, but I had that sense anyway.
But you felt it.
I love the music. I don't think there's anything that transcends the Anglican choral tradition. It's just, I think it's ethereal and heavenly. So it was all of those things. And I sometimes say, I have 2 semi-flippant answers to how I became an Episcopalian. My first semi-flippant answer is that it was reaction to the aesthetic deprivation of my childhood. And there's some truth to that. My second answer is that I grew tired of the cult of novelty. And you know this very well from Willow Creek and other places that, it was always, let's try something new. And I wanted to say, let's try something old. And in part because I'm a historian, I know that's part of it as well. And I was a bit of an Anglophile at that time during graduate school, so that played into it. But I found in the Episcopal Church a kind of latitude, a freedom to preach the gospel as I understand it from my reading of the Bible, and no one has ever sought to rein me in. And theologically, I think probably many of my sermons are fairly conservative theologically. They would be, probably acceptable at the Trinity Divinity School Chapel. Not that I've ever been asked to preach there. A bit of a sore point, but. It also...
Well, you've actually caught some... I mean, you're a prolific writer and thinker, historian. You've caught some hell from the right, haven't you?
Oh, sure. No, it's it initially it stings, I suppose, but then I take it as kind of a badge of honor.
Yeah. I read one article. It looked like the Gospel Coalition didn't like your thesis.
Yes,
that the religious right grew out of segregation and race.
Right.
And of course, your history is well documented, but they didn't. They didn't like that.
Copiously documented, and they didn't present an alternate.
Sure. Yeah. I get why they go, I don't know if we want to be associated, but you're right. Randall, how long have you been at Dartmouth? Do you teach undergrads and grads?
We don't have graduate students here
at Dartmouth.
No.
So how long have you been teaching undergrads at Dartmouth?
At Dartmouth just since 2012. So before that, I was at Columbia for 27 years.
Okay.
Right.
So here, teaching religion.
Yep.
So as you see, what has changed in an 18, 19, 20-year-old with hearing the history of religion for most of them, not all, but the country they grew up in, many of their backgrounds. And then now you taught 20th century students, so now you're teaching 21st century students.
Sure. Yeah.
What are you seeing? Does that give you hope for Christian spirituality ahead? Or
I'm not sure I'm terribly qualified to answer that question because my courses tend to be fairly large and more lecture oriented. So I don't really do seminars anymore like I did back at Columbia. But there's certainly a great deal of interest on the part of students, and also incredible religious illiteracy. They just don't know. I mean, and one of the courses I teach, for example, is on the 60s, which is not in the religion, it's in the humanities. Which I love. I love this course because we do fashion, we do politics, history, art, music, of course, and it's just great. And my introductory lecture, I talk about the various things, as a survey going through the 60s, and then I play Joni Mitchell's song about Woodstock, right?
Oh, wow, sure.
We got to go back to the garden, and I asked him, what's she talking about? And I have no idea. No idea.
Yeah.
The Garden of Eden. And then I have to explain that. Yeah. So, the students I get are fairly illiterate in terms of religion and certainly theology. I did Calvinism the other day, just yesterday, I guess. And they were fascinated by this. They were fascinated.
Yeah.
Well, if there's predestination, how does that square with universal salvation? I said, well, it doesn't very well. But that's fun. That's fun.
Wow.
Keeps me young, I think. I hope it does.
Yes. Well, man, your writings have been tremendously influential on me.
Thank you.
As my own life at times has had religious, theological, existential crises in my own faith. Believe it or not, your history writings, because there's a lot of heart in your writing as well. I enjoy how you write. I just want you to know, have not only been influential, they have been balming and calming.
Oh, David, that's very kind of you
to me. And so keep writing. I know you're probably in a wonderful season of adult children and grandchildren, but
no grandchildren yet. But
yeah, and Hanover is. I've been there. It's a nice New England town. But
it is nice. Yeah.
Randall, thank you so much for being on this podcast, and thanks for you really are the foremost, if not the most, prolific person on American Christian religion over the last 400 years here. So, and I think any comments you have about forecasting where we're headed or the urgency are we should listen to your thoughts on that. So thank you so much, Randall.
David, you're very kind. I've enjoyed the conversation a lot.
Yeah, me too. Thanks for being on the podcast.
God bless.